Good afternoon, everyone. This is take 2 of the historical notes on Thursday afternoon. I'm going to begin by talking about postmodernism. I'm also going to tell you a little bit about metafiction, and then we're going to discuss the importance of the historical notes and The Handmaid's Tale, and we'll end by looking at some of the connections on the subject of history and on the subject of postmodern narrative between the different texts that we're studying. Okay? Postmodernism is not a time. Lots of people in my class are often writing that Duffy writes in a postmodern period. We have to be very careful about that because postmodernism is more to do with style, as I'm going to show you. Obviously, it's after modernism, and so postmodernism predominantly occurs after the war. But I will show you now that by no means are all writers who are writing now postmodern. There has to be certain generic features in their work for them to be considered postmodernism, okay? Now, why have I chosen this particular picture? One of the big things about postmodernism is, unlike modernism, which tends to be very serious, postmodernism is often very jokey. In modernism, writers like Joyce and Woolf wanted to be unique. They wanted to have an original style, something that Walter Benjamin calls a signature to their work that made them instantly recognizable. But postmodernism, on the other hand, it tends to be characterized by intertextuality. I'm sure we'll all recognize which artist this is. Salvador Dali, yeah? And we will see that in this case, you can see the Simpsons are superimposed here. And another thing about postmodernism is it often involves mixing the high and the low, okay? So we have the high art of surrealism, and that is contrasted with the low art of the Simpsons and the cartoon form. This is very, very important because postmodernism tends to be characterized by discontinuity, brokenness, fragments. So if we think about a poem that I've just been teaching my Year 13 class, The Virgin's Memo, which is a kind of apocrypha poem, isn't it? Untranslatable fragment, a memo. Well, postmodernism is very often broken up, discontinuous in this way. And I'm sure that you can see that that's going to be very relevant to The Handmaid's Tale. And often there's a move away from stream of consciousness, from consciousness being a unified thing, to consciousness being fragmented into many different forms. Postmodern writing is often extremely confusing and hard to follow. For those of you who studied atonement in the past, you will realize as well that postmodern literature frequently involves an element of metafiction, which I'm going to go on to in a second, okay? So the key element is the idea that it's a non-sequential narrative, okay? I put down 4 different examples of postmodern novels here that all use non-sequential, fragmented narrative in different ways, okay? Some of the things that they might do is parallel timelines. So one story told by one person, another at the same time by somebody else. You might have, obviously flashbacks and episodic narratives, but these things in themselves are not exclusively postmodern. Where I think postmodernism comes in is that there is a complete absence of a kind of unifying factor in the text. So if you read a modernist text like To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf, it's told but from a number of perspectives, and it is confusing. A postmodern text might leave vast chunks out. It might also convince you not to necessarily believe the narrator. It confuses you quite often. It has unreliable narrators that we can't trust. So the whole effect of postmodernism is to disorientate the reader, leave them wondering what the truth was. As I will show you a bit later, one of the key features of postmodernism is the abandonment of the whole idea of grand truth. A recognition that life is relative and that all we can have is fragments or small truths. Another key feature of postmodernism is the idea of hybridity, the idea of joining things together. I said already that in postmodernism you often get a combination between the high and the low. We saw that with Bart Simpson and Salvador Dali. But of course, as I'll go on to show, this is also a feature very much of post-colonial literature, where in post-colonial literature, as we'll see, we get very different viewpoints from the dominant perspective of the colonizer. We also have increasingly in post-war fiction, this is something you need to know about, the rise of science fiction and fantasy. And one of the key features of it is that it starts to become actually canonical literature. So if we look at Margaret Atwood, for instance, she's written what we could say is a kind of science fiction book. Some of you will remember that she doesn't actually like the label science fiction. She prefers the label speculative fiction, okay? Now, at the moment, we know The Handmaid's Tale is a very, very important novel in this particular genre. And again, we'll see this idea of blurring the boundaries between the high and the low. Now, I have a picture here of Salman Rushdie, who's one of the most infamous postmodern novelists at the moment, and his famous book here, Midnight's Children, which I know Shreya knows, is a search for identity. And what makes it so unique, and this is another feature of postmodernism, is the use of magic realism. What is magic realism? How does it differ from what came before? Well, I guess the thing about magic realism is it doesn't in any way section itself off from everyday events. The idea is that fantasy becomes a very everyday, quotidian feature, and the reader doesn't know if they're reading a realist story or if they're reading a fantastic element of the story. The two are blended together. So what's the common feature of postmodernism then? It's the idea of hybridity there. It's the idea of disorientating and confusing the reader. It's the idea that we cannot arrive at truth. If you read a very famous postmodern book like The Life of Pi, that was turned into a famous film, you never get to know what the truth was. You just get rival versions of the book. Now, in The Handmaid's Tale, we certainly experience that when we encounter Nick, don't we? We have the different versions of sex between Offred and Nick. We don't know which one to believe, do we? At no stage are we given one which is the definitive one. In some ways, Offred may be suggesting to us there are only versions of that event. And that is a key feature of postmodernism. The final thing that I'm going to talk about with postmodernism here is the idea of marginalized voices. And this will be very useful for you in terms of thinking about Duffy. And in terms of thinking, I can see Alicia's laughing, about world scholars, okay? So we have the idea of the voice of the other. Now, in your 1945, post-1945 course, this is the key feature of post-1945 literature. It is basically about the voices of black people in Britain, who are represented as the other. There is the voices of gay people, isn't there? And that will go hand in hand with elements of queer theory that we'll be studying again. You also have the voices of women, don't you? So if we think ethnicity, color, the rise of working class voices, we have multiple new perspectives. And that helps to explain why postmodernism is so fragmented and why there's this belief that there is no ultimate truth, only versions of the truth. A very useful little table, and I don't have long enough to go through all of it, so I'll leave it to you. What I would say the most important thing would be to look at is the idea that modernism is to do with the absolute, with some kind of truth. And postmodernism is very much characterized by relativism, okay? I think one other thing that I think that is really interesting is the idea that modernism tends to be structurally, in terms of narrative, about progress, about a move forward. So if you're reading a book by Virginia Woolf, yes, it's fragmented by stream of consciousness, but broadly it moves forward. Postmodernism, on the other hand, tends to move back and forward, be circular, just like we're going to find in The Handmaid's Tale, and be very, very hard to place in terms of any plot timeline, okay? And I think we can see that with The Handmaid's Tale at the end, when we don't even know what the order of the story was going to be. Now, what's really important, and we were looking at Duffy today in my class, and we were talking about the fact that Duffy often represents the female body as being mutilated, being acted upon, like in The Diet or in The Woman Who Shopped. You get a very similar phenomenon in The Handmaid's Tale. Some of you will remember that Offred refers to her tail as limping and mutilated. Now, if we actually think about the relationship of the narrative to the body, then you may recall that Offred is sitting in the bath in one scene. She experiences her naked body as the other. It is no longer her body. It has become owned by the state of Gilead. It's become something foreign to her. When we look at the ceremony, she says, the commander is effing the lower part of my body. Do you remember that? So she experiences her body as mutilated, as truncated, doesn't she? As cut into sections. And this metaphor then extends to the narrative itself. Because the narrative, of course, is cut in sections for a whole variety of reasons. The first being that there is a male editor who reassembles the body of the narrative according to his wishes and not Offred's. But of course, the narrative itself is cut into different sections because Offred is unable to write it, isn't she? And therefore, the narrative is reassembled at some later date and is in fact never written. It is actually recorded on a series of tapes. And what's very important about that is the initial metaphor that we encounter in chapter 1, where she refers to the palimpsest. I'll talk a bit more about this, the idea of writing over writing. Don't forget that this is tape over tape, isn't it? So you have layers of meaning that fits in with the postmodern idea, the idea of the world of the already written, nothing new, everything intertextual. Now, metafiction is very, very important that we understand this. And metafiction is a form of fiction which emphasizes its own constructedness. It is simply a writer saying, hey, guys, this is only a novel. Don't believe in it. And in many ways, if you study drama, you could compare it to Bertolt Brecht and the idea that when you go and see a play, Brecht doesn't want you to believe in it. He doesn't want you to get lost in the story. He wants to have alienation effects saying, hey guys, you're watching a play. This is not a piece of entertainment for you to get lost in. It's not fantasy, you know, that I don't want you to have like a lovely story time. I want to teach you something. So I'm going to jolt you out of this world and I'm going to remind you that you're only reading a story. Now, of course, that is exactly what happens to us when we start to read the historical notes. Now, many A-level students don't even read the historical notes. They stop and they don't finish the novel because it's kind of disappointing, isn't it? So the historical notes, for a start, I think it's really important that you write down are bathos. They are anticlimax. We look for an ending, we look for closure, don't we? But what do we get? Instead, we get metafiction. We get told Offred, who has become like the love of our life, our narrator that we trust, her voice soothes us, doesn't it? Suddenly we're told that this is not a narrative that we're in any longer. We're jolted out of it into an incredibly unfamiliar, hostile voice, aren't we? And that's going to be very important. So this element of metafiction. And what is the effect of this? The effect of this is that it disorientates the reader. I thought that this was a lovely little bit of an essay that I snipped for you. Imagine yourself sitting in a lecture hall. It's the 25th of June, 21 and 95, and you're about to hear Professor James Darcy Picciotto deliver a talk on the problems of authentication in reference to The Handmaid. Look at this title, The Problems of Authentication. It's a kind of what you call a hermeneutic of suspicion. He interprets it within an idea of suspicion. He's not trusting it as history. So all of a sudden, we know what this narrative cost Offred, the danger, and how interesting it was. But here it's going to be discredited. And we're going to move into a different genre, the genre of kind of objective history. And in many ways, therefore, Offred's perspective is going to be discredited. I'm sure you're all thinking about the figure of history in Duffy, aren't you? Or you might be thinking about the fact that Blanche is not believed by Stella, is she? So we recognize something which is the erasing of female history, the muting of female voice, and the overwriting of this by what we could call a kind of male-centered history. Mr. Burke and I earlier were talking about history from above and history from below, very important. History from below is the voice of the common people, isn't it? Often left out of history. And this is very much the paradigm that Professor Picciotto is working in, isn't it? Which is that a real, authentic account would be a kind of sociological, political study of Gilead. And because Offred doesn't have a recourse to that kind of information, because she writes from a person-centered, female-centered point of view, her narrative becomes discredited. Okay, what's so interesting is I gave you the introduction on hybridity, did I not? And I did for this reason. Margaret Atwood plunges us into a world of hybridity. Look who the professor is. Marianne Crescent Moon, Department of Caucasian Anthropology. I'm sure Shreya would like this. So instead of white people going around and studying strange other cultures from an anthropological point of view and looking at their odd customs, etc., what have they become? They have become the subjects of anthropology. They are no longer the dominant culture. They're no longer what we could be called a sort of hegemonic culture. They've become the objects of the study, haven't they? I should say, they've become the subjects of study, not the subjects who study. I'm going to talk something. This is Margaret Atwood's greatest joke. I'll talk a little bit more about Deny None of It, University of Deny None of It. And the other thing I wanted to talk to you about, the keynote speaker is Professor James Darcy. Sounds like Jane Austen's Mr. Darcy from Pride and Prejudice. What a lovely, posh Anglo-Saxon name. Unfortunately, though, we have this Picciotto, and I never really know where he comes from. I don't know about you guys. It always sounds vaguely Japanese to me, but I'm told that someone else said to me there's a Mexican feel to it. It doesn't matter. What's the point that she's making? The point that she's making is we now live in a hybrid community, don't we? So the commander and all the WASP people, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant people who were dominant in Gilead, seem to have been displaced, don't they? And like I say, they become the curiosities of history now. And later you'll see in the historical notes, a wonderful thing is, as part of this conference, you get to dress up in the funny Gilead costumes. Just like we might say, white dominant culture treat other cultures as a kind of costume party. So now they have become the masquerade where you can put on their weird clothes and enjoy the novelty of role play. Now, when we enter this, we move from the personalized language of Offred's voice. We experience Offred's voice as speaking to us directly. She addresses us in the second person quite a number of times. She says, I believe in you. So don't we all feel close to her? And she's a wonderful storyteller, so we've listened to her story. So we're jolted from that personalized oral tradition of storytelling into a dry academic language. There's something really arrogant and upsetting about Picciotto. And I think that Atwood is very clever at showing the egotism of male academia, the elitism and ivory towerness of it all. And he sets out, really, rather than to study her and to rescue her narrative and to help us understand her narrative, he really sets out to discredit it, doesn't he? Again, we could call this very much a kind of male-centered approach to history, the striving for objectivity. And because he feels as though she hasn't, achieved this criteria for it to be considered history, he more or less dismisses it, doesn't he? Very odd, of course, because how could Offred have written from a transcendental point of view? She's stuck in this society as the victim of it. All she can do is convey her narrative from that perspective. But to Professor Picciotto, this is a kind of crime, and he discredits it as history. I also feel that he treats history like a playground. Doesn't seem to have very much empathy. He seems to be from that school of history that don't believe that psychological empathy is part of the discipline. He doesn't really care how she feels. He clearly has no concern for her experience and her suffering. So our pompous patriarch, and perhaps this is the worst thing that he says. In his lecture, he says, "We know this city was a prominent way station on what our author refers to as the underground female road." Now, if we think about the palimpsest, this is, of course, a intertextual reference to slavery. And what's it called, Mr. Bird? Underground Railroad? Underground Railroad, which was a system that allowed slaves to escape. So we need to think that American history was about slavery and about people trying to escape. Gilead, of course, is a new form of that slavery. It's the handmaids and women who have become the slaves, okay? And so we have that section of the palimpsest. Remember that idea of layers upon layers, okay? But notice what he does here, and look at the language he uses. Historical wags. Very pompous, kind of archaic saying, isn't it? A wag, of course, being someone who's a naughty, funny person. This naughty, funny person has called it the Underground Frail Road. That's very misogynistic, I feel. I don't know about you guys, referring to her as frail in this particular way. And you'll notice the audience are also shockingly politically incorrect, aren't they? Because they find it very funny. And it actually gets worse from here, as I'll show you in a moment, okay? Again, rather than taking her at her word, rather than understanding her within her situation and her context, Professor Picciotto says, she could have told us so much more about the workings of the Gilead Empire had she the instincts of a reporter or spy. It's an accusatory tone, isn't it? It's dismissing her and her whole narrative. Again, we know from the novel that the only time that Offred actually has access to the news is once, when she's with Serena Joy. And we're told that the children of Ham, which seems to be a reference to black people, it seems to me, I don't know if you agree with that, Mr. Burke, African Americans, had been hunted in the novel. So she doesn't have access to this kind of information. All she has is whisperings of how the state works. And I'm going to suggest to you that that is a feature of totalitarian society and of dystopian literature. It comes out of Kafka, this idea that we don't know how the society is working because we simply don't have access to those kind of power structures, do we? Now, here we have this as well. Look at this now. Doesn't this strike you as very postmodern? Being a partial transcript of the proceedings of the 12th Symposium. Does that sound like the Virgin's memo, do you feel? Postmodernism, fragmentation, parts, never the whole, no full understanding. Again, it seems to me that Atwood's having a little joke with us and playing with some of these postmodern conventions, okay? And here's my favorite joke of all of it, because it took me 3 years to realize this. The University of Deny None of It. Say it to yourselves. Deny none of it. Is it Margaret Atwood's little joke to us? Reminding us that we should trust Offred. Is that the author positioning herself against Picciotto and asking us to take her literary creation on faith. And I think it's a very clever little joke, as I said, that could easily be missed. Of course, you know, interestingly, it is a real place though, as well. So she must have heard that place name and thought, I can achieve this in this very clever way. I think I've covered that. Now, the cassette tapes are very interesting, aren't they? Because they spoil things for us, don't they? Because what we realize is that we don't have a contemporaneous narrative. What makes The Handmaid's Tale such a joy to read is that we feel that Offred is talking to us in real time, don't we? And that we have an up-to-date, authentic account of everything she's done. Hey, typical postmodernism, what do we find out? It was written long time later. I said written, it wasn't. It was recorded a long time later, so that it's more like Wordsworth's description of literature being emotion recollected in tranquility. So again, the authenticity of it is spoilt for us in some ways, isn't it? It's a Brechtian moment, isn't it? An alienation moment where we no longer feel we can completely trust our narrator. Is she a liar? Well, I'll leave that up to you. Why would she record it in such a way that it would appear as though it's a contemporaneous account? Those are questions that only you can answer. And these tapes are tapes that are taken from Mr. Burke's and my time. Good old days. In fact, more my time, Mr. Burke. I think you're a little bit older. Culture Club by Boy George. Why would he be there? Trance. Okay, we're looking at hybridity, aren't we? Boy George being one of the first guys to dress up in a kind of, not quite trance, but lots of female clothing, long hair, makeup, etc. Slightly different from David Bowie in the sense I think he was really foregrounding his homosexuality, wasn't he? One of the things for you to remember, The Handmaid's Tale, it's about the right-wing conservative reaction to my generation's time, to the AIDS epidemic, to increasing gay rights. And the right show their rage and anger and their desperation to return to a much more stable idea of binary sexuality. You might argue there's a race element in it as well. And these are things that I think we could connect today with Trumpism. Elvis is in there. Again, I suppose Elvis is in there to sort of typify the kind of excess of pop culture, overeating, drug taking, etc. The things that Gilead want to crush. And then finally, my favorite here, Twisted Sister, who have to go down as the ugliest woman the world has ever seen. Obviously a kind of heavy metal group, again, who play with gender, don't they? Wear long hair, dress in like tight leather trousers, etc. They're confusing and destabilizing gender. And today, this is exactly what we hear from the right wing, isn't it? What is so evil about Marilyn Manson and his friends? We don't know if they're boys or girls. They hate hybridity above all things. So the palimpsest, I mentioned it earlier. It came up in chapter 1. The gym was referred to as a palimpsest, can you remember? And she could remember the smell of high school and high school sex. Do you remember that? So that the smells become a kind of text, don't they? And there's something very great about this. It's something that I've always believed is even when people try to erase the past, there are always traces of it. So the palimpsest, you'll know, comes from, was it Rome? It was Rome, wasn't it? And it's the idea, wasn't it, that clay tablets were expensive, so you would write on them, blah, 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 like here, and then obviously you would rub them out. But unlike my digital rubber, traces of the writing underneath remained, didn't they? And therefore it became like a stencil of layer of writing upon layer of writing. Now this is quite a triumphant thing, I think, because it sort of goes against what dystopian totalitarian cultures want to do, which is erase the past. And that is almost always a feature of totalitarian cultures. If we think about, I believe the Khmer Rouge, Mr. Burke declared it the year zero when they came to power, didn't they? And the notion was that history began then, didn't it?
Well, the French Revolution did it first, and they began year zero as well.
And so there's something kind of sinister about that, isn't there? You know, even though these people might say, hey, we're starting a new idealistic future, it's the scrubbing away of the past which can be seen as kind of quite terrifying. And in The Handmaid's Tale, you'll recall that the aunts boast that the younger generation will have no memories of the past at all, so that they will be able to scour history clear. Well, the palimpsest suggests otherwise, doesn't it? And of course, this also relates structurally to the tapes, because the tapes have been recorded over, have they not? So that music has been recorded over them, and that's an ideal disguise.
And of course, it's also a post-modern trope, isn't it? Writing on top of writing, and genre on top of genre. So the palimpsest, in many ways, is a metaphor for the structural form as well.
And that's something that we could use in your writing when you're trying to contextualize unseen work. Can you see now the danger of identifying it as postmodern? Don't do so, because plenty of writers are writing today and they don't write in a postmodern way. Now, of course, another trope, of course, is this idea of editing, isn't it? Because what we realize is that the tapes have been edited, have they not? Now, we know that there are plenty of books like Frankenstein that many of you have studied before that have editors, framed editors. But in this case, what's happened, going back to the postmodern idea, is that it has been reassembled. And we do not have a kind of linear narrative, do we? We have a narrative that seems to go up and down and all over the place and cyclical. So in the end, Offred is not in control of her narrative. There are male editors who do that. And this is a male editor who makes a joke about her backside. So if we think about it as somebody who is not even sympathetic to her, we could say that in many ways her voice is framed by a patriarchal narrative, which arguably robs it of some of its meaning. Professor Picciotto says, Professor Wade and myself had to arrange the blocks of speech in which they appear to go, but as I've said elsewhere, all such arrangements are based on some guesswork and are to be regarded as approximate. Again, relativizing everything, destabilizing us as readers, taking away our authenticity, taking away our ability to believe in this narrative, etc. Now, another thing that the historical notes does, it also supplies us with very valuable backstory. And in some ways, I've said to you that the historical notes takes away from the believability of the earlier narrative, but actually, in some ways, it provides verisimilitude. It makes it seem as though it was true. Because look here, he says, need I remind you that this was the age of the R-strain syphilis and the AIDS epidemic. Absolutely key AO3 point, isn't it? It situates it. Now, if, like me, you came from the 1980s, and I think Mr. Burke will agree with me, there was a huge right-wing backlash against feminism and promiscuity. And the religious right obviously declared that homosexual people were being punished by God. It was referred to as a gay plague. But it was also a great stick to beat feminism with. These horrible slutty women who wouldn't wear bras had created this horrible virus that was being visited upon the earth, okay? So it provides kind of historical validity to The Handmaid's Tale. So it's not, doesn't go one way. You know, in some ways it relativizes a story. In other ways, it seems to corroborate it as well. And what is very interesting is that Professor Picciotto is the person who names the story, is he not? And The Handmaid's Tale seems to be another intertextual reference, remember this AO4 intertextuality, to the Canterbury Tales. Now, we don't study that anymore because our millennial children can't deal with Old English, can they? Our Middle English, Mr. Burke. But Mr. Burke and I certainly did Chaucer when we did A-level. And in many ways, Chaucer would be considered the equal of Shakespeare. You know, I think he's been eclipsed now, but in the past he would be seen as absolute canonical. So what's he done? He's placed Offred's tale in the male canon of literature. And you might argue that's another way in which female voice is being eclipsed, okay? And this is the bit I think in particular the girls might find upsetting. He says here, when he thinks he's so clever calling it The Handmaid's Tale, he says, I am sure all puns were intentional, particularly that having to do with the archaic, vulgar signification of the word tail. Those of you familiar with American slang will know that tail means your ass, basically. And he's making a joke, basically saying, the handmaid's ass. Now, is that in good taste? Given that Offred is effectively a human trafficked sex slave, in some ways you might argue worse than a sex slave, more of a womb slave, isn't she? An enforced surrogate mother of the state. Does it seem like not only tasteful, but does it seem like the kind of thing you'd expect an academic who understood that society to say? I would say not. It seems vulgar, it seems ill-chosen, and it further alienates us from this horrible, arrogant, pompous male lecturer. And maybe it pushes us back to Offred. Now, the historical notes end with Professor Pixiotto comparing Offred to Euripides. And this is incredibly important. You need to understand this classical reference. For a start, you'll notice it's a classical reference, isn't it? Professor Pixiotto is always very anxious to foreground his learning, isn't he, Mr. Burke? On a number of occasions, he makes little obscure intertextual points, etc. He's trying to place himself within an academic canon. Now, Euripides was the lover of Orpheus, and Orpheus was the great lute player in ancient Greece. When Euripides died, he was heartbroken. Lovely romantic story, this. So Orpheus was not prepared to allow Euripides to live in the underworld. He went into the underworld, which was guarded by the three-headed dog Cerberus. And because he was a wonderful musician, he played his lute and he put the dog to sleep. And then he was told by Hades, yes, you can take Euripides, as long as when you take her, you do not look at her on that whole journey. Of course, as they came to the end, Orpheus, being a little bit hungry for her, looked back at her, and immediately she turned into worms and decomposing flesh, and she was lost forever. Now, why would Pixiotto say this? Well, he's kind of suggesting that Offred can't talk to us, that the gulf of history is too great. And this reminds me of, say, some anthropologists who say things like, we simply can't understand the minds of those people. Now, some people might argue that that has some validity, but there's also something very frightening about that point of view, isn't there? Because it basically says these people cannot communicate with us. And so to Professor Pixiotto, who's the great expert on Offred, he says that she's Euripides, that she's lost in the underworld, decomposing, and she can't be with us. Now, you may feel very dissatisfied with that point of view, and I would suggest that Margaret Atwood wants you to be satisfied with that point of view. And I'm going to say to you now that that positions Offred as the mute subject, as the person who has no voice. Effectively, he takes her voice from her. See here, we may call Euripides forth from the world of the dead, but we cannot make her answer. She's muted, isn't she? She's like Duffy's character in Loud, or the Virgin Mary and the Virgin's Memo. Their voices are discredited, invalidated, turned into things like memos or apocrypha, scraps, or their voices aren't heard. So you can see the connections between them. Once again, I'm sure you can see the connection with Blanche, whose voice won't be heard when she lives in an asylum, because her voice will be the voice of the insane and the irrational, once again discredited. So I hope you can see the links and how beautifully our three texts fit together and interlock. And what's so tragic about this is the value of storytelling is therefore absolutely negated. I would like to believe this is a story I'm telling. I need to believe it. I must believe it. For those who can believe that such stories are only stories have a better chance. If I'm telling a story, the story I'm telling, I have control over the ending. Then there will be an ending to the story and real life will come after it. I can pick up where I left off. Now, think about the metafictional nature of this. Do we get this ending? So we never get this closure, do we? We're robbed of the closure. Instead, we're given this dreadful, inconclusive ending where the storytelling that was so valuable to her, that she felt validated her, has been made invalid. What's Margaret Atwood telling us about history? Well, one of the things that clearly we're seeing there is the cycle of history, aren't we? Gilead was this awful place, wasn't it? Then it fell. But did things get better? No, because we're back in this patriarchal conference, aren't we? Where women's testimony once again is being discredited. So this seems to go against the Hegelian idea of history, which is the dominant paradigm in the West, that things are progressing. It would appear to me that Margaret Atwood is questioning this notion that things are progressing, and she's problematizing that very much so. I think that it's very important to remember that Margaret Atwood not only was a historian of Puritan culture in the United States, and I believe the book is set somewhere near Harvard, isn't it? In New England. It seems to be set there, doesn't it? Yeah. She also had a relative who was burned as a witch. And one of the dedications is to her old history professor, isn't it? So she had a great interest in this Puritan aspect of life. Another key thing to remember, and this is something that you can use in A Streetcar Named Desire as well, there is no American dream. There are American dreams. And there seems to me a big conflict in American culture between the spirit of capitalism, which you may argue comes from Methodism, this idea of getting rich, renewing yourself, changing your life, and the spirit of Puritanism. Because a lot of people forget the people who came from England to arrive in America wanted to start a theocracy, something like the Taliban style in the Christian world. Now, maybe that's a bad analogy, but in both cases, they want theocracies. They want society being run on religious principles by religious people. And it seems to me to be the case that Margaret Atwood is wanting to remind us of that legacy, those antecedents of American history. The city upon a hill, isn't it, Mr. Burke?
So that was the kind of the first sermon given on the ship. The first ship goes over from England to found the first colony, the English-speaking colony, where they said that England was doing to create a shining city on a hill, an idea and a metaphor that was followed by Ronald Reagan in his inauguration speech. So it's a dominant strain in American politics.
And this idea, I mean, I believe at one stage they thought about calling America Jerusalem. You know, this idea that it was a holy kind of promised land, a kind of land of Canaan, wasn't it?
That's why so many cities and towns in America are Salem. It's one of the most common names of towns and cities. I think in every American state is Salem, it's supposed to show Jerusalem.
Yeah. Now, on this PowerPoint, which I'll make available to you, I put some notes down there. We don't have time to look at them. I'm just quickly going to go through a few now. If we think about the neglected female voice, we have Pixiotta making Offred mute, as I showed you. That would be a direct comparison to any of these Duffy poems, History, Sab, Anon, The Virgin's Memo. And I've no doubt that you could do others. This, you know, we could do white writing, for instance, yeah, where the writing is in some ways illegible within the black male canon, yeah? The amputated body, which we've covered, the limping story, Now that's very easy to link in particular to Beautiful. This is a wonderful link where Marilyn Monroe, do you remember, is cut on the film and dumped on the floor. At the end of her life in Beautiful, do you recall that the policeman goes and looks at her vagina and invades her privacy so that she's sexually violated even in death? So again, a very shocking kind of comparison, and one that works very well across the text. History, the poem of the neglect of history. And of course, we can link this to, in particular, the idea of Her Story, the idea of a female-centered history, which is often entirely eclipsed. Now, I think it's very clever that Duffy has the figure of history as a kind of urine-stained, old, neglected lady. She situates that within sort of the year 2000 and British concerns about the neglect of the elderly. It's a very nice and clever link. As I said, we've dealt with this one, Duffy's poem, Beautiful, which again is a wonderful, here is the line that I talked about, the smoking cop who watched as they zipped her in the body bag, noticed her strong resemblance to herself, the dark roots of her pubic hair. Who's the most famous blonde in the world? And only her pubic hair is the real self. What's Duffy telling us about femininity? That it is a masquerade, okay? Which is very important, you know, for third wave feminism. This idea that femininity is an act, something that you wear and dress up in. And that's it for today. I hope that you enjoyed that and that it actually did quite a lot. I won't take any questions now because I'm not Professor Picciotto.